You're listening to The Boring History for Sleep, Why Medieval Horses Wore Tiny Shoes in the Alps. Tonight, we'll wander ancient snowy trails, follow hoofprints through frozen passes, and discover how something as small as a horseshoe helped carry centuries of quiet survival across the mountains. Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow creaky ride up into the Alps fog, curling over narrow ledges, the smell of damp moss, and the faint, tinny jingle of something, not quite bells. You glance down. A procession of shaggy, short-legged horses trudges past, their hooves clinking delicately on stone, and on their feet, tiny, almost dainty metal shoes, more dollhouse than draft horse. You're not dreaming. You're standing in a centuries-old alpine pass, where these funny little hooves were once the unsung heroes of trade, travel, and survival. The air is thin, the path thinner, and the drop. Don't ask. You probably wouldn't survive this on foot, much less riding bareback on a goat-sized steed. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time you're listening. I always love seeing where my sleepy history travelers are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle forward along the winding path. Pine needles crunch under your boots. The slope ahead is brutal, craggy stone switchbacks that seem designed more for goats than horses. And yet, here comes another team of the strange little beasts. Their legs are stubby, their manes tangled with frost, but they move with surprising grace. And on their hooves, those tiny, gleaming iron shoes, clinking like wind chimes against rock. No cart, no rider, just one lone mule, loaded with firewood and the ever-so-slight air of smug competence. Welcome to medieval alpine travel. You settle onto a rock for a breather, and that's when an old man face like wrinkled parchment, voice like smoke sits beside you. Funny shoes, eh? He says. You'd think they were made for toy ponies. Turns out, those dainty metal shoes weren't just a fashion choice. Up here in the Alps, they were life-saving equipment. The rocky paths would shred bare hooves, and the icy stretches, a slippery death trap. Without proper shoes, even the hardiest mountain horse might freeze, stumble, or tumble, and if the horse goes down, so do you. The old man leans in. No, not all horses wore shoes. Down in the lowlands, many didn't bother. But here, he taps his stick on the rock. This land chews through hooves like a wolf through soup bones. That's not a common phrase, but he seems proud of it. So you nod politely as the cold air thickens. You start noticing more travelers, pilgrims with cloaks flapping in the wind, traders leading ponies laden with sacks, a woman riding side while chewing on a turnip. Every hoof that hits stone makes a soft metallic plink. It's like an orchestra of patience and practicality. A fun fact for your mental journal: the average alpine packhorse wasn't a sleek stallion, it was a squat, tough-as-nails breed, often no taller than a modern pony. These horses were designed for balance, not speed, and their tiny hooves, perfect for gripping mountain trails, especially when wrapped in customized metal shoes, sometimes as small as your hand. Historians still argue whether these miniature shoes were a product of horse evolution, terrain, necessity, or regional fashion. What's agreed on is that the Alps demanded a very different kind of hoofwear than the muddy fields of France or the broad Roman roads of Italy. You follow a group of monks trailing up the incline, their robes tucked to their knees. Each leads a horse or mule, and one even has a pair of spiked snowshoes tied to his own sandals. The animals, outfitted with tiny iron plates embedded with frost nails, medieval ice cleats. Basically, you smile to yourself. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you'd always assumed history was full of grand events and kings in golden armor. But tonight, here you are, tracing the footsteps of shaggy horses with absurdly small shoes. And somehow, it all feels more human. You pass a wayside shrine carved into stone. A rusted horseshoe, one of the tiny ones, is nailed beside it, a symbol of safe passage. You bow your head instinctively, not because you're religious, but because something about this journey feels sacred in its own sleepy, iron-clinking way. The sun slips behind a glacier-topped ridge. You adjust your scarf, listen to the rhythmic hoofalls fading ahead, and keep moving. Somewhere up there is a warm fire, a mug of spiced ale, and maybe, just maybe, a story about how these ridiculous little shoes came to rule the mountains. But, for now, your legs ache in all the right ways. Your eyelids droop just a little, and the sound of metal on stone is almost hypnotic. You let your thoughts drift. 2 horse hooves, iron rings, and the curious places they've been. You wake not that you were truly asleep, with a jolt of brisk alpine air curling under your cloak. The sun is a little higher now, throwing long golden beams through the pine trees and bouncing light off frost-covered stone. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorts, followed by that now familiar plink of metal shoe meeting rock. You stand, stretch, and watch one particularly scrappy little horse pick its way over a ledge no wider than your arm. It's unnerving. You feel your toes curl just watching, but the horse, utterly unfazed. Its tiny hooves, each clad in a horseshoe that could almost double as a door knocker, land with perfect certainty. So, why were they so small? The answer, it turns out, lies partly in the terrain and partly in horse anatomy. Medieval alpine horses weren't bred for glamour or jousting tournaments. They were short-legged, broad-chested, and, dare we say, built more like donkeys than chargers. Compact and sturdy, they were like the medieval SUV, no frills. But they'll get you on your 30 sacks of goat cheese across an avalanche-prone pass in February. Their smaller hooves weren't a flaw. They were an evolutionary advantage. Less surface area meant greater precision on unstable ground. Like a mountaineer using the edge of a boot to catch a ledge, these horses relied on small, agile hooves to navigate narrow paths and uneven terrain. And those tiny shoes, reinforcement, traction, hoof protection, in a land made entirely of things that want to stub your toes. You follow the winding path upward, watching where you place each step. The terrain changes every few feet, earth to gravel, gravel to slick, shale, shale to ice. For a barefoot animal, this would be misery. For a shod horse, just another Tuesday. At a bend in the path, you meet a merchant balancing a cage of clucking hens on his back. He pauses to rest, and beside him, his mule huffs, in relief. You notice its shoes gleaming faintly in the sun, each fitted with a pair of tiny metal studs. For grip, the man says casually, noticing your stare. Steep slope just up ahead. Ice this time of year. You nod like that explains everything, which, well, it kind of does. Here's a fun aside. While most people picture medieval horses with those thick, clunky iron shoes nailed on like some blacksmith's afterthought, the alpine versions were more specialized. Shoeing a mountain horse wasn't just a matter of protection. It was a science, sometimes even an art form. Blacksmiths shaped lighter weight, narrower shoes designed for minimal drag and maximum grip. Some added serrated edges. Others drilled tiny holes for frost nails. Occasionally, you'd see horses in something called hipposandals, a kind of early, detachable shoe strapped over the hoof with leather or cord. Not elegant, but effective. Now, whether these tiny shoes actually made movement safer or just slightly less terrifying, that's still debated. Historians argue whether the real benefit was hoof preservation or improved traction, or, if, in some cases, the shoes were more ceremonial than practical. One theory suggests that monastic travelers even blessed the shoes before a long journey, much like sailors praying over their anchors. Who knows? When you're walking a horse over a mountain, You'll take whatever protection you can get. You pass another horse, no older, graying eyes, half-lidded with fatigue. Its shoes are worn thin, their nail heads flattened from hundreds of miles. You wonder what stories those hooves could tell. How many times they've scaled this path. How many winters they've outpaced an avalanche. You're not alone in thinking that way. Alpine communities often treated these horses as more than tools. In some villages, they were given names, buried with small ceremonies, even painted into religious frescoes. One chapel you passed earlier had a mural of St. James guiding a humble mountain pony across a stormy ridge. Tiny iron shoes painted in gold leaf. You glance up, the ridge ahead narrows again, and now the trail is carved into the side of a sheer rock face. Chains have been bolted into the wall for travelers to grip. You hold on as you edge forward, heart drumming, and marvel once again at the horses who do this with 4 feet and no hands. It's in moments like this, when you're clinging to a cliffside at a 45-degree angle, that you realize just how finely tuned those hoof-sized shoes had to be. Too big, and they'd catch on rock edges. Too thick, and they'd throw off the horse's balance. Too smooth, and one wrong step turns into a plummet. One local legend even tells of a village farrier who forged a set of shoes from meteoric iron, believing their heavenly origins would grant protection from mountain spirits. Historians, naturally, are skeptical, but a horseshoe forged from a star feels like the kind of thing you want on your side when crossing the Alps in January. Eventually, the path levels out into a snowy plateau ringed by crooked pine trees. You spot a watering trough half frozen and a small shrine decorated with hoof-shaped carvings. Another horseshoe, tiny as ever, hangs from a nail, polished by wind and weather. You touch it gently, like a talisman, and take a deep breath of pine-sweet air. The horse ahead of you lets out a satisfied huff and shakes snow from its mane. Its little shoes clink once more as it trots forward, like it's saying, "Come on, we've got miles to go." And so, you follow. Your boots crunch over a patch of ice-crusted mud, and you slip just slightly only to catch yourself on the rough wooden edge of a mile marker, shaped like a crooked cross and etched with Latin. Ahead, the trail dips and vanishes into mist, but above that, bells, not the crisp, chapel kind, but gentle, clinking ones attached to harnesses and tails and sacks of salted meat. A line of shaggy mules appears through the fog, led by a man with a red hood and a face carved by wind. He's humming something between a hymn and a tavern tune, and behind him trots the reason. You're about to fall behind in pace. An entire pack train, loaded with goods for monks living in a mountaintop monastery you hadn't even realized, was nearby. You offer to help, and to your surprise, the man shrugs and tosses you a lead rope. "Take Filbert," he says. He's the lazy one. Filbert, it turns out, is a mule with half-lidded eyes, a permanent lean, and hooves the size of soup bowls each, perfectly shod in the signature tiny iron shoes of the Alps. So here you are, part of a medieval postal service, the mail, wheels of cheese, jars of pickled onions. One particularly fragrant satchel, you're told, is dried monkfish. You trudge through the mist, rope in hand, Filbert lazily clinking behind you. The Alps in the high Middle Ages weren't just scenic, were busy. These trails were lifelines for isolated monasteries, remote farms, and alpine trade hubs. Letters, food, wine, relics. Everything had to come over these peaks on the backs of animals, and everything depended on those same animals not falling off a cliff. Which, again, brings us back to the shoes. Monks in the Alps often served as wayfarers, guides, even rescue workers, particularly the famous ones from the St. Bernard Pass. Yes, the dog came later. They had an intimate knowledge of how to shoe a mule for snow, how to load a pack evenly for balance, and how to spot black ice under powdery snow. Without horses and mules properly outfitted for the conditions, monasteries would go without supply. Worst, and you, Medieval you are now part of that system. Filbert clinks behind you, slower than a prayer, but steady. You pass beneath arches of bent pine, across footbridges cobbled together from bark and rope. At one point, the lead mule slips just slightly and the entire line pauses. The red-hooded man mutters something in Latin, spits in the snow, and checks the hooves. Sure enough, one of the shoes has cracked at the edge. Too old, he grunts. Should have replaced it last week. Out comes a tool from his belt, an iron hook, a hammer, a handful of nails that jingle like tiny bells. He kneels, and with a speed that can only come from doing this in sleet, fog, and worse, he fits a new shoe onto the mule's hoof. The smell of hot iron and wet hide fills the air. And you realize, these guys were the real postal service, far before any king's decree or royal courier, and they did it with hooves. Here's a quirky little nugget for you. In some alpine communities, the postal pack mule would be blessed at the beginning of winter and painted, with a white stripe down its back to show the path to angels. Not all historians agree this ever actually happened, but enough woodcuts and oral legends repeat it that it lingers part fact, part fairy tale. Filbert sneezes and nearly faceplants into a snowbank. You catch his rope just in time. By midday, the fog burns away, revealing an utterly surreal Citan abbey perched on the cliffside like something out of a child's drawing. Towers, turrets, smoke curling from a chimney. The mules perk up. They know this place. Soon, you're unloading. The cargo wheels of cheese handed to a novice monk with chapped hands. Sacks of dried beans stored in a pantry so cold it could refrigerate soup. One monk, tall and stern-faced, thanks each mule with a gentle pat. "These are good shoes," he murmurs, inspecting the hoof of the lead mule, wrought well. His tone is reverent, almost priestly. You wonder if he means the shoes or the journey. Historians still debate the extent to which monasteries influenced shoemaking techniques in the Alps. Some believe monks helped standardize patterns, materials, and even seasonal adjustments, like adding nails with extra grip during thaw season. Others argue that farriers were too independent, and that monasteries simply adapted what worked. Either way, these tiny shoes weren't made at random. They were born of trial, error, and maybe a few rolled ankles. You're invited to rest beside a fire. A steaming bowl of broth is pressed into your hands. Someone hums in the corner. It's warm here, almost timeless. And above the mantel, a horseshoe again small, perfect, and gleaming in the firelight. Filbert has already curled up in the hay outside, hooves tucked under him like a sleepy cat. You sit a little deeper in your chair, the warmth soaking in through your bones, and feel that peculiar sensation of belonging, not to a place, but to a rhythm. The rhythm of hooves on ice, the rhythm of bells in mist, the rhythm of tiny shoes making their slow, clinking way across the roof of Europe, century after century. You close your eyes, just for a minute. You awaken to the smell of ash and hay, curled into a pile of wool blankets someone must have draped over you in the night. Filbert, ever punctual in his laziness, is still asleep nearby, legs folded like an origami sculpture, tail twitching, occasionally in dreams of hay bales and slipping travelers. His hooves, those marvels of medieval engineering, peek out from the straw, dull in the soft morning light. You rise slowly, stretch, and step out into the abbey courtyard. The air is brisk, filled with the mingling sounds of mule brays, murmured prayers, and the unmistakable tink-tinkt of hammer on iron. You follow the sound around the corner, past a stack of cured hides and empty grain sacks, until you come to the source, a smithy tucked between the chapel and the granary, smoke billowing like incense from its crooked chimney. Inside, the warmth hits your cheeks first, then your ears, then your toes. A farrier stands hunched over the anvil, apron dusted with charcoal and soot, eyes squinting through the steam as he draws glowing red metal from the forge. This isn't the thunderous clang of an English battlefield blacksmith. This is careful, methodical, like watching someone tune a violin. He taps, pauses, flips the metal, taps again. The horseshoe taking shape is barely the size of a saucer, its arc, deliberate. Its heel turned slightly inward. He sees you watching and gestures you. Over. You know what they call this one? He asks. His voice is gravel soaked in honey. A grip tooth, because it bites into the ice. He cools it in water with a hiss like a whisper. Then he holds it up for inspection. Takes longer to make than a regular shoe, he mutters, but saves lives. This one, you nod reverently. The farrier explains that alpine horseshoes weren't simply small versions of standard ones. They were often designed with specific terrain in mind, flatland shoes, good for marshes, meadows, but mountain paths that required narrow branches, deeper toe grabs, and lightweight design so it wouldn't throw off a horse's balance. Imagine hiking in clown boots. That's what a heavy shoe feels like to a horse on a ledge. He shows you his rack of variations: shoes for rain, for powder snow, for shale, for muddy thaw. One with jagged edges like the rim of a saw. Another studded with bronze tips. That one's for frost so thick it sings under your feet, he says. Here's the weird bit. Some shoes weren't even nailed on in times of travel, especially for horses used by messengers or merchants who couldn't afford downtime. Blacksmiths crafted temporary shoes that strapped on with leather called hipposandals. They weren't elegant, and they often clunked around awkwardly, but they could be removed or replaced mid-journey without injuring the hoof. It's basically the medieval equivalent of a snow chain. You ask how he learned all this, and he shrugs. My father, and his father, and his. He gestures toward a horseshoe nailed into the wooden beam above. It's rusted nearly through, tiny as a child's bracelet. That one went up the St. Dodio Pass in a blizzard. 14 mules. 12 came back. You let that math sit there for a moment. Historians still argue whether alpine blacksmiths shared techniques with one another or hoarded them like secrets. Some evidence suggests a loose network of traveling farriersmen who moved from village to village, sharing methods, trading tools. Others claim it was all localized, passed down by lineage and trial and error. One fragment of an old journal even describes a guild of the hoof operating out of Chur, though most believe that's more fable than fact. Still, there's something monastic about this whole setup. The smith works in silence again, humming faintly. Outside, a novice monk leads a mule to the forge. The animal's gait is off, favoring the front left leg. Lost a nail. The monk murmurs. The farrier nods, already prepping the tools. You watch as he lifts the hoof patiently, like holding an old friend's hand, and checks the worn shoe. One nail missing, another loose. The hoof itself is chipped at the edge. I'll fit him with a frostbite tongue, the farrier says, not even looking up. You blink a what? He explains it's a specific curve in the toe of the shoe that helps catch traction on downhill ice. Developed by accident. Apparently an apprentice farrier once hammered the wrong shape, and instead of slipping, the mule stuck the descent like a gymnast landing a dismount. The rest, as they say, is medieval shoemaking lore. The hoof is cleaned. The new shoe, heated, shaped, and set. Nails driven in, with a rhythm that feels ancient and musical. The smell, earthy, smoky, with a note of something like burnt toast. You realize how much trust a horse must have to stand still through this. One twitch, one misstep, and this delicate dance becomes dangerous. The monk pats the mule's neck. The farrier wipes his brow with a square of wool. You're handed the old shoe, now bent and useless, and for some reason, you don't want to let go of it. It's strange to think of a horseshoe as something sacred. But here, surrounded by cold rock, old tools, and centuries of memory clinging to iron, it feels like one, not a lucky charm, a lifeline. You step outside, the cold biting your cheeks again, Filbert, awake now, greets you with a yawn, so exaggerated, you wonder how his jaw doesn't fall off. You pat his neck, his shoes look fine, slightly worn, but good for another few miles. A bell rings once, somewhere above. Not chapel dinner time, but the clink of metal, the shape of fire-forged iron, and the steady rhythm of hoof and hammer linger in your mind, like the end of a lullaby. And so you follow that sound, once more, into the mountains. You're back on the path, now though, calling it a path feels generous. It's more like a frozen ribbon of rock, frost-glazed and slanted just enough to make every step feel like a dare. The sky has gone that pale gray color that means snow is coming, but not yet. Not now. Not before you learn what the horses wore when winter went from poetic to lethal. Filbert plods ahead, ears twitching. His hooves click against the rock, softer now, more muffled. You squint and realize his shoes have been altered. Tiny metal studs like antique thumbtacks, the outer rim. Someone's taken the liberty of upgrading him with frost nails. Yes, frost nails. Because while modern hikers worry about crampons and yak tracks, medieval horses had their own winter wardrobe. As snow and ice took over the Alps, blacksmiths got creative, embedding iron studs into shoes to give grip on the slick terrain. Some even added tiny cleats, bent outward like fangs. Horses became walking medieval snowmobiles. Well, slower and furrier, but you get the idea. You descend into a shallow valley, snow thick underfoot now. The landscape is hushed, the kind of silence that makes you whisper without thinking. Your breath comes in puffs, and every clink of hoof against snow-ringed stone echoes like a church bell in a cathedral made of ice. Here's a thought you didn't expect to have. You now understand why horses used to wear snow slippers. These were padded leather or woven rope covers, slipped over the metal shoes for added traction and warmth. Yes. Medieval horses wore overshoes, and the effect was somewhere between adorable and absurd. Imagine it, a line of serious work-weary mules trudging over an icy pass, each with fluffy hay-stuffed slippers tied to their hooves like kids heading to a pajama party. But it worked. The slipper acted as both insulation and grip, soaking up meltwater and preventing the hoof from icing over. Some slippers were even disposable. Traders would carry stacks of them, layers of woven grass or leather, soaked in pine tar and reinforced with twine, and switch them out mid-journey. More than once, a weary merchant must have muttered a prayer of thanks that his horse had dry feet, even if his own socks were frozen solid. Historians still debate whether this practice was widespread or just a regional quirk. Alpine communities left behind scattered references, some letters, a few illustrations, and one beautifully useless poem comparing a horse's hooves wrapped in winter's blanket to the Virgin's swaddling cloth. Nobody knows who wrote it, but it's tucked in the margins of a 13th century breviary. Someone clearly cared. You keep walking, now flanked by a group of grain traders who nod to you politely. Their horses, too, have studded shoes, and one even has a dangling bell braided into its mane. For safety, someone explains. To hear if they fall off a ridge. Comforting. One horse catches your Aja, big fellow with shaggy hocks and eyes like melted chocolate. His shoes are different again, fitted with what look like spikes. You sidle up to his handler, a woman with a thick accent and a face like bark. She's got glacier hooks, she says, noticing your interest. Winter's bad this year. Glacier hooks. You blink. Yes, it's a thing. In especially severe conditions like the northern passes, where ice doesn't melt until June, horses were sometimes shod with what were essentially mini ice picks. Not elegant, definitely not comfortable, but it meant they didn't go skidding off the path like medieval curling stones. You step aside to let the group pass and find yourself by a wayside marker, another carved shrine, this time dedicated to Saint Eligius, the patron saint of horses and farriers. His image is barely visible, worn by wind and snowfall, but someone has nailed a fresh horseshoe just below his face. A very small one, frosted with new snow. Your hand brushes it gently, like a quiet thank you. The descent begins. The path narrows. Again, and now the sound changes. No more hollow clinks. Now it's crunch-nap-crunch, as frost nails dig into ice, gripping with that bite the farrier mentioned. You almost slip, but Filbert doesn't. He digs in, muscles bunching, tail swishing, hooves finding purchase, with the calm certainty of someone who's done this 50 winters in a row. And now, just to mess with you, the wind picks up. Snow begins to fall in earnest fat wet flakes that stick to your eyebrows and melt inside your collar. Visibility shrinks. You can barely see Filbert's ears. The wind howls like a wolf choir. You clutch the lead rope tighter and whisper a half prayer to no one in particular. And still, the hooves keep moving. You remember something the monk said back at the abbey fire. Shoes are trust. They carry our hope from one side of the mountain to the other. It sounded poetic at the time. Now, it sounds like gospel. The storm slows. The snow thins. You emerge from the cloud bank to a wide frozen meadow, dusted and white, like powdered sugar. The silence returns, heavier now. You and Filbert walk side by side. You notice a line of hoofprints, ahead clean, symmetrical, studded like Morse code. They stretch across the field, disappearing into the trees like an invitation, and for the first time, you don't follow them just because you have to. You follow them because, somehow, you've come to trust those tiny shoes. The wind dies down, leaving only the slow creak of ice-laden branches and the soft crunch of hooves pressing into fresh snow. You and Filbert trudge through the frost-laced field like explorers at the edge of the world, but up ahead faintly, at first comes a sound that makes your ears perk. Clink-thud. Clink-thud. Then voices, muffled curses, a hoarse neighs, and metal clatters on stone. You round a snowy bend to find a group of men in armor, their cloaks weighed down by wet snow, their mounts fidgeting nervously at the edge of a steep icy decline. One of the knights is on foot, inspecting, a hoof his own, if possible, even more frozen than the horses. You pause, just far enough to not intrude, and take in the scene. Knights in the Alps. You hadn't expected this. But here they are, plumed helms dulled by frost, breastplates fogged by breath, trying to coax their warhorses down a slope that looks like a frozen waterfall. And it's not going well. One mount tall, proud, and built like a cathedral slips slightly and throws its head back in protest. The knight pulls the reins gently, then bends to inspect the animal's shoes. Not the usual kind. These are reinforced, thick, probably made for flat terrain or royal roads. Beautiful, and useless here. A shorter, older man, clearly not a knight, steps forward, shakes his head, and taps his own horse's hooves with a stick. You hear it, the clear, sharper tink of studded shoes. Smaller, lighter, like Filbert's. They should have brought mountain ponies. Someone mutters. You find a rock to sit on, partly for rest, partly to gawk, because it's a strangely satisfying sight. These towering noblemen, commanders of castles and men-at-arms, humbled by slush and slippery stones. Their armor might be worth a king's ransom, but their horses can barely walk the path. One knight dismounts and starts removing his horse's shoes entirely, hands stiff with cold. Another waves him off. Nonsense. We'll wait for the farrier. Turns out, even medieval nobility needed tech support. Historians still argue whether knights regularly used alpine routes or avoided them whenever possible. Some records suggest elite troops were sometimes stationed at alpine passes to protect trade routes or to move quickly across borders without alerting enemies. Others think that's overblown, and that most knights only attempted these routes under duress, like in pursuit or retreat. Whatever the reason, they're here now, and they're struggling. You and Filbert hang back as the group finally lets the old guide lead. His horse stout, unbothered, and wearing shoes the size of teacup steps, confidently onto the slope. The knight hesitates, watches, then follows. The descent begins. The trick: tiny steps, loose reins, and shoes designed not for parade grounds but for ice, rock, and the sheer unpredictability of gravity. One of the horses slips against a slide. Not a fall, and you hear the familiar scrawk of a frost nail digging in. Saved. Again, fun fact. Some high-altitude knights actually modified their horses' tack for alpine warfare. Lighter saddles, lower stirrups for balance. Some even tied wool to the hooves for temporary grip, though whether this helped or just created soggy hoof mittens is still up for debate. Another knight curses as snow seeps into his boots. "My squire better have packed dry socks," he mutters. You try not to laugh. They disappear into the tree line, leaving behind a few hoofprints and a half-frozen patch of dung that steams gently, like it's trying to escape the narrative. You and Filbert follow a different trail, rising again now, switchback carved into rock, narrow enough to make you lean instinctively toward the cliff wall. As you climb, you picture what it would have been like for those war horses. Taller, heavier, less sure-footed, clad in armor, burdened by men also clad in armor. All of it depending on 4 little iron rings. At one bend, you find a horseshoe, embedded in the mud. It's small, narrow, and cracked at the arch. You lift it, turn it over. There, etched faintly into the inside curve, is a mark, a tiny star. Possibly the maker's stamp, possibly something else. You pocket it, not because it's treasure, but because it feels like a message. Filbert snorts behind you, and you remember he's still wearing his full set. You give his hoof a gentle pat. "You're smarter than any knight," you whisper. He chews on a pine cone in agreement. Eventually, you crest the ridge. The trees open up, revealing a view so wide it feels like falling. Jagged white peaks on every side, valley mist curling like smoke below, and the sound of distant hooves echoing like a heartbeat. You sit down, breath misting, and take it all in. Somewhere down there, knights in frost-covered cloaks are still fumbling their way toward glory, or at least toward dry socks. And here you are, beside a mule named Filbert, both of you warm enough and steady-footed, thanks to some tiny iron shoes. You trace the etched star on the one you found, and you wonder how many stories like this were never written down. How many tiny shoes never made it into chronicles or tapestries but still, somehow, shaped the mountain passes. How many knights rode into legend because a mule got them there safely. You pull your cloak tighter, the air turning blue with twilight, and down the trail, another hoof rings out. The trail takes on a gentler slope now, winding like a lazy river through snow-dusted pines and frozen grass. You and Filbert have found a rhythm again. Hoofstep, breath, hoofstep, breath. The wind has dropped to a whisper, and the hush of the alpine forest wraps around you like a woolen blanket. You're not alone for long. A soft jangle draws your attention to a bend in the path, where a caravan of traders comes into view. 3 mules in front, 2 behind, and a cart in the center, narrow enough to barely fit the path, but stacked high with barrels, baskets, and bundles of cloth. The lead trader waves you over. He's got kind eyes and a beard frosted at the tips like sugar. "Heading to the Salt Road Junction?" he asks. "We could use the company." You nod and fall in line. Filbert sniffs one of the other mules, like an old acquaintance. They exchange a brief grunt. Apparently, that's enough for a truce. The trader explains that his goods are destined for a market 3 valleys over. Salt, mostly. Some herbs. A few spools of imported silk. You glance at the cart's tiny wheels and the narrow axle. He laughs. "It's not the cart that matters," he says, tapping his led mule's hoof with a gloved finger. "It's the shoes. Get those wrong, and you don't make it to miles." As if on cue, one mule slips, slightly, but catches himself with a clink and a grunt. The trader doesn't even glance back. "Wedge shoes," he says, smugly. best for early thaw. You learn quickly that alpine trade was a carefully orchestrated hoof ballet. Mules were shod, not just based on season, but by trade route. One path favored rounded shoes for traction. Another required split-toe designs to deal with loose shale. There was even a popular shortcut known for its stream crossings, where traders fitted their horses with hollow shoes that let water pass through without causing rot. That's right, ventilated horseshoes. Because when you're walking across 10 miles of ice, your number one enemy isn't just cold, it's wet. Here's a strange tidbit. In some towns, the blacksmith wasn't paid in coin, but in trade, good salt, firewood, or even cheese. Shoes became currency. A well-fitted shoe might earn a loaf of bread, a set of frost-ready wedges. That got you a night in the barn and a place by the fire. And while the lowlands had their bustling towns and market stalls, the alpine trade world was one of checkpoints and cliffside inns, places where travelers warmed their hands over shared stew pots and compared hoof gear like medieval sneakerheads. You pass one such outpost. Just before dusk, the sign above the door is a horseshoe nailed upside down. Locals swear it keeps the luck in. A man outside is fitting a new shoe to a restless mare. He works quickly, efficiently. You watch the sparks jump from his hammer in the twilight. Inside, the caravan unloads. One trader pulls out a ledger and checks items off with a quill. Another unwraps a bundle of smoked fish, the smell instantly filling the room like an edible fog. The air buzzes with quiet chatter, the clink of mugs, and a low rhythmic hum of animals settling in. A boy not more than 10 sits by the hearth polishing a set of horseshoes. They're tiny, polished to a mirror shine, with copper nails laid beside them in a neat row. He glances up, sees you watching, and smiles proudly. "My papa says these are for the spice ponies," he says. "They're real fast." Spice ponies. That gets your attention. Turns out, small alpine ponies were often used for high-value cargo spices, dyes, even tiny scrolls of parchment wrapped in wax. They were nimble, quiet, and easy to disguise among flocks of sheep. Their shoes, lightweight, silent, and sometimes painted black with soot to avoid detection. Medieval stealth tech, right there on 4 hooves. Historians still argue whether these ponies operated more as smugglers or state couriers. Some believe monastic networks used them to pass information during times of war or plague. Others think it's mostly myth. But the shoes themselves, tiny, blackened, often recovered near abandoned mountain paths, speak for something. The fire crackles. Filbert dozes near the door, occasionally snoring with such intensity that mugs rattle slightly. You sit back, sipping something warm and questionable, and look around at your fellow travelers. Every face here weathered, soot-smudged, calms, part of a quiet economy held together by hooves and iron. Trade didn't just move down royal highways. It crept across cliffs, scaled glaciers, and tiptoed through moonlit paths in snowstorms. Without horses and, without those funny, tiny shoes, the Alps would have remained isolated, silent, and hungry. A woman beside you says, "Funny thing, isn't it?" You glance over. She gestures toward a rack of used shoes on the wall, each labeled with the route it came from. Salt Pass, Monk's Ladder, Widow's Teeth. Every one of those meant someone made it. You stare at the shapes, some narrow, some rounded, all worn down at the edges. Not trophies, not tools, just survivors. You nod and take another sip. The warmth settles in your chest. Outside, the wind picks up again, but gently now, like a whisper over the snow, and Filbert, half asleep, lifts a hoof and lets it fall back to the floor with a soft, satisfied clink. The morning arrives, not with fanfare, but with stillness, the kind of quiet that suggests the snow has hushed the world into obedience. You awaken in the caravan, in with the sound of hooves not galloping, but delicate tap-taps against the stone courtyard below. Peeking through the frost-trimmed window, You see a farrier working in the open air. But something's different this time. These shoots aren't just functional. They're fabulous. Curled at the toe like a jester's slipper, polished to a shine that catches the milky morning light. These horseshoes look less like mountain survival gear and more like fashion statements. You wrap your cloak tight, shuffle outside into the cold, and hover at a polite distance. The farrier, a lanky man with an expression like he's seen things, gives you a nod. "Trade fair coming up," he says, gesturing to the shoes. "Gotta make the ponies look their best." You blink. "For fashion," he chuckles. "Well, not just fashion. Prestige. People want their animals to look the part, especially the big merchants. You should have seen the Baron's pony last year, gold inlaid shoes and silver buckles. Thing walked like it owned the mountain. And suddenly, it makes sense down in the more populated lower passes, where villages held festivals and traveling. Fairs turned otherwise sleepy towns into temporary kingdoms of color. Horses became more than beasts of burden. They were billboards. Wealthy traders dressed their animals like medieval influencers, plumes on the bridle, embroidered saddle blankets, and yes, ornamental shoes. Some were purely decorative, worn for processions, and then swapped out for the real ones before hitting the trail. Others tried to merge beauty in function, curled-toed horseshoes that provided grip and panache. Of course, the practicality of curling metal toward the frog of a hoof is questionable. Historians still argue whether these designs ever helped, or if they were just a very expensive way to make your mule look like it belonged on the runway. You spot one such example tied up near the water trough, a gray alpine pony, with daisy patterns punched into its shoes. As it shifts its weight, the little floral designs leave perfect snow prints with every step. Utterly ridiculous. Utterly charming. "Doesn't that wear out faster?" you ask. "Oh, absolutely," the farrier says. "But that's the point. Showy shoes don't last." Keeps the blacksmiths employed. You wonder how many people judged a trader's value not by what he carried, but by how his animals were shod. Turns out, some towns kept a public record of notable hoofwork. It was kind of a mix between guild pride and nosy gossip. If a noble's mount arrived with mismatched shoes, oh, the drama. If a merchant's mule had flashy new nails made of bronze, word spread faster than wildfire. The blacksmith shows you a few other showpieces, one embossed with a family crest, another fitted with tiny bells that tinkle gently with every step. "That one's mostly for weddings," he adds. "Scares off ghosts, wait ghosts." He nods solemnly. "Alpine spirits don't like jingling, of course. You remember a legend from last night's inn about a trader who disappeared on the Widow's Teeth Pass, only to be found months later, horse intact, goods intact, but the man gone. Locals said he forgot to jingle. Whether it's true or just a warning to buy more bells from the local smith, who's to say?" Further along the path, you spot another peculiar horse, a black mare with braided mane, strutting proudly beside her handler. But what catches your eye are her shoes, glossy red. Painted horseshoes were a real thing, especially for ceremonial events. Red for protection, blue for peace, gold for honor. The pigments, often made from crushed berries or oxides, wore off quickly, but made an impression while they lasted. In some regions, painted hoofs were used in betrothal rituals. The groom's horse would arrive with blue shoes, and if the bride accepted, her family would paint their mule's hooves in red. It was less about horses and more about symbolism, hoof-based. Love letters in iron and dye. You trail behind the pony parade for a while, watching the waveform begins to flirt with function. Where does utility end and beauty begin? It's not a question exclusive to hooves. You think about how many tools in history became ornate simply because someone had the time and ego to embellish them. Shields, swords, belt buckles. Why not shoes? But here in the mountains, beauty had to serve a purpose or, at least not get in the way of one. An alpine horse wasn't just pretty. It had to climb. It had to survive. You sit for a moment on a low stone wall, watching one of the fancier mules pick its way down a gravel slope. The shoes gleam, but they hold. You suppose, if you can't slip while looking good, then maybe you're onto something. Filbert, bless him, has been observing all this without a shred of jealousy. His shoes are dirty, practical, and slightly dented, and yet he trots along, unfazed by floral prints or crimson polish. You rub his ears. You've got nothing to prove, buddy. He farts softly in reply. A final fun fact before you move on. In one remote alpine town, archaeologists unearthed what appeared to be a horseshoe with tiny gems, garnet or possibly red glass, set into its surface. Most scholars think it was never worn, just ceremonial. Others believe it was worn just once, and with great drama. Maybe a noble's funeral, maybe a holy pilgrimage. Whatever its use, it proves this: even in the harshest places, humans couldn't resist a bit of flair. And neither, apparently, could their horses. You and Filbert walk on his hooves, clink rhythmically behind you. Not flashy, not famous, but steady. And really, in the Alps, that's the most fashionable thing of all. The path narrows again, not because of the terrain this time, but because of conversation. A group of local straders, monks, herders, and one woman carrying 3 chickens in a basket have gathered at a fork in the trail. Their mules munch. Hey, someone passes around a skin of wine, and the subject of debate. You guessed it, horseshoes. Not just any shoes, tiny ones. Curled, spiked, nailed, strapped. Everyone has an opinion, and no two people seem to agree. They're too small to be useful, says a short man with a beard that looks like a frozen mop. Smaller shoes just make the poor beasts walk like ducks. Shows how little you know, counters a woman in layered wool, with arms like cured ham. Small shoes mean less drag, more stability. You want them clomping like knights. They're not ducks, the bearded man mutters. They're not knights either. You settle on a nearby log and listen, sipping from a tin mug someone hands you. The air is thick with debate, wood smoke, and that charming blend of mule and onion. This isn't new. Historians still argue whether the alpine horseshoeing practices actually improved traction, or if they were over-engineered traditions, handed down more by ritual than result. Some say the shoes saved lives. Others insist it was just low expectations. One parchment found in a 15th century abbey refers to devout herders who place faith in the 4 iron rings, implying that shoeing might have been treated as a kind of superstition in some corners of the Alps. If a mule slipped, perhaps the farrier had sinned. If it climbed well, perhaps it was divine approval. We'll never know for sure. But these debates, oh, they're eternal. You chime in, asking if anyone's ever tested bare-hoofed mules on the same trail. A shepherd scoffs. Test them. What? Like in a laboratory. You shrugged. He laughs. One of my father's mules went shoeless, he continues. Said it was natural. That was, until it cracked its hoof on granite. Then it wore a shoe for the rest of its life and never once thanked him. He chuckles at his own story. So does everyone else. The monk chimes in next. He's older, bald, wrapped in a cloak that smells faintly of beeswax and dried figs. We once tried sandals made of cork, he says, with the solemnity of someone discussing failed prophecy for noise reduction. Pilgrimage season, and someone asks. He sighs. We lost 3 down a ravine. The 4th just stood still for 2 days. Wouldn't move, like he was embarrassed. More laughter. Someone coughs up a sip of wine. These stories continue for an hour. Tales of copper shoes that shattered, of shoes that fell off mid-descent and caused chain reactions of chaos, of horses so particular they refused to walk unless their front and back hooves matched in style. You learn of the 4-nail doctrine, A belief that using only 4 nails instead of the standard 6 made the shoe more flexible and responsive. The pro-4-nail folks cite examples of lighter steps, smoother motion, and happier animals. The anti-4-nail crowd, while they point to the infamous Slippery Harold incident, where a courier's horse lost both front shoes, mid-run, and slid into a monastery wall with such force it cracked 3 ribs and a stone baptismal font. The horse survived. The font did not dot. And all this from tiny shoes. Eventually, a wiry herder with eyes like flint and breath like garlic leans forward and delivers what may be the most compelling argument of all. It's not the size of the shoe. It's the soul of the beast wearing it. A silence falls. No one dares argue with that. Even the chickens cluck reverently. You stay until the fire burns low. Until the wineskin's been passed a few too many times, and until Filbert, patient as always, snorts loudly and starts pawing the earth like, "Can we move on?" Or, "So, you do." As the trail picks up again, the conversations echo behind you like half-remembered dreams. Somewhere back there, folks are still debating, still telling stories, still deciding whether the horses walked like ducks or danced like saints. You and Filbert walk alone now, the snow crunching softly underfoot. His shoes worn but sturdy leave tiny prints in the half-melted trail. You think about how much effort, argument, and affection went into designing something so small, so practical, so quietly magical. Just a curve of iron, a few nails, maybe a little paint, but that curve might mean the difference between a fall and a foothold. Between reaching the monastery or being stuck in fog for 2 days with a passive-aggressive mule. You look down at the track he's left, then back up at the sky, where stars are beginning to emerge, distant, glimmering, each one impossibly far away, yet unmistakably there. Like all the stories behind those shoes, you smile, not because you've solved the debate, but because, finally, you understand why they still have it. The trail grows thinner as evening descends, not in width, but in presence. It doesn't disappear so much as it fades, merging into the mountain slope, as though the rocks themselves have forgotten it ever existed. You and Filbert pick your way along carefully, hooves softly clicking over frosted stone, breath puffing clouds into the amber air. The last pass is near. You can feel it, ahead, silhouetted against a melting gold horizon. A wooden post leans at a lazy angle, another waymarker, carved with faded runes and wrapped in strips of cloth. Offerings maybe, or just weather-beaten repairs. But dangling from its crossbeam is the unmistakable shape of a horseshoe. Small, worn, and hanging like a wind chime in a place with no wind. You reach up, fingers grazing its chilled surface. It doesn't ring. It rests. You sit nearby and let your legs dangle over a slope so steep it almost isn't real. Far below, mist pools in the valley like breath held too long. You can't see the bottom. Maybe that's for the best. Filbert stands close, his body warm against the side of your arm. His shoes are caked in snow now, but they've held strong all day, all week, through cliffs, storms, saints, and superstition. And now, in the waning light of this journey, you begin to think about how much was carried on those tiny, unlikely hooves: salt, grain, cheese, letters, silk, secrets. Not just goods but connection, movement, life, trade. Routes like this one weren't just commerce, they were arteries, pulsing with the heartbeat of every sleepy hamlet and cloistered abbey, from one peak to the next. And those pulses, they ran not on speed or strength but on balance, on trust, on hooves the size of dinner plates and shoes no larger than your palm. You remember a story you heard earlier, half fable of a princess sent to marry across the range. Her entire dowry traveled by mule, gold packed in barley sacks, documents tucked beneath salted hams. It said the mule that carried her wedding veil slipped on black ice, and only regained footing thanks to a pair of newly fashioned split-toe shoes, invented by a lovesick blacksmith who'd been left behind. Is it true? No idea. But the fact it could be is good enough. You rise, dust the snow from your cloak, and begin the descent. The stars begin to prick through the dusk above, quiet and curious, like eyes watching from eternity. With every step, the crunch of snow is paired by the tap of iron, the melody of filberts for shoes syncing with your breath. The trail twists downward through forest and frost, the path softer now, more forgiving, and with each turn, you pass traces of those who came before. A patch of worn earth, a pile of old nails rusted into a knot, a boot print frozen beside a hoof mark, centuries apart, and yet somehow in step. Eventually you see lights, a village, smoke curling from stone chimneys, a stable roof dusted in snow, the inn sign swings, in the brisa carved pony mid-prance, one hoof lifted like it's showing off its shoes. You and Filbert approach slowly, as if savoring the final few steps. Someone waves from the stable, a boy, lantern in hand. You made it, he calls. Long road. You nod, too tired to answer properly. Filbert walks into the stall like he owns it, finds a bucket of oats, and promptly begins devouring them with wild abandon. You reach down and tap one of his hooves gently. The shoe is loose at the heel, a little worn at the edge, but still holding strong, as you hang your cloak by the hearth and feel your bones begin to thaw. You think about how easy it would have been to overlook this whole story, to dismiss those little shoes as quaint relics, or worse, unimportant. But now you know. You've walked the ice, heard the arguments, seen the flair and the function, the mishaps and the miracles. And through it all, those shoes carried not just beasts but burden, not just trade but trust, not just travelers but time itself. You lean back, boots off, eyes heavy, and the last sound you hear before sleep finally pulls you under is a soft, rhythmic clink, like a memory, like an echo, like for tiny shoes crossing the Alps one more time. Now, settle back, let your shoulders soften, let your breath slow. Outside the window, the snow still falls silent, steady, gentle. No more treacherous passes, no more wind or debate. Just flakes drifting past rooftops and hoofprints, already fading in the white. Imagine yourself lying in hay sweet straw beside a sleepy mule. The fire is crackling in the hearth. The smell of pine smoke hangs in the air. And outside, the mountains keep their watch, ancient and calm, their edges softened by snow and memory. The sounds of the day clinking shoes, crunching snow, voices telling tales fade into a warm hush. You are safe now. The journey's over. No more narrow trails. No more worn-out souls. Just a soft bed, a tired body, and the kind of calm that only comes after miles walked in stories heard. Maybe you dream of frost nails, or curling shoes with bells, or a village farrier whistling as he shapes iron in the glow of his forge. Maybe you don't dream at all. Either way, you've earned your rest. Let go of the saddle straps in your mind. Unpack your burdens. Let them settle. And if the silence is too silent, imagine that gentle clinking against faintly, just enough to remind you that somewhere, in another time, another world, another century, someone's still walking the snowy trail, still trusting the shoes, still crossing the Alps, one tiny step at a time. End of script. Sweet dreams.